Welcome to Reading Between the Reels. I'm Matt Leader.
And I'm Craig Dickinson. Today on the show, we are looking at The Matrix. So, Matt, The Matrix, what are your overall thoughts?
So, I actually watched this fairly recently and rewatched it again for this episode. And, taking the time to kind of look at it very closely and kind of look for the cinematic aspects that we like talking about on the show, it made me appreciate the movie more, actually. I think that it's always been a very entertaining film. Very clearly, it was an influential movie for blockbusters, action movies, and Hollywood in general. But it's just like, it's a really solid story. Uh, I'm sure you'll bring this up later and talk about it a little bit more, but the hero's journey. It is a very classic example of hero's journey storytelling. And I find myself, I'm just get sucked into those kinds of narratives. And so it's like, I've got a few quibbles here and there, but it's largely, it holds up really well. And I found myself kind of sinking back into, yeah, this is a really good film.
Yeah, I watched it a couple times recently. Obviously, rewatched it, just a few days ago for this episode. But I think it was a month or two ago that my wife and I, introduced it to our son, who's finally old enough to see it. And I kind of knew that we'd be doing it at some point for the show, and so I started to kind of turn on that analytical brain while I was watching it, and noticed quite a few things that we'll be talking about today. I was like, yeah, make sure I pay attention to that next time I watch it. And it, yeah, just I've always enjoyed the movie, but I do agree that you can kind of enjoy it on a whole other level. And that's one thing that I try and tell my students too is, even if you've seen the movie or you're having to watch something you don't want to watch with your family, you can find another way to enjoy it if you start pulling out these cinematic aspects. You can entertain yourself, just by looking at it through a different lens.
Mm-hmm.
My first overall thought, other than that, is that this is the film that made me see Keanu Reeves as anyone other than Ted, because he'll always be Ted Theodore Logan from Bill and Ted for me. That was the first thing I ever saw him in. And, when he was younger, he was not that good of an actor. He was Ted every role he played. But in this, I totally believed it. Like, that made me feel like, yeah, he's also Neo. He fully embodies Neo. And I'll talk more about that when we get to performance. But another thing that jumped out a lot this time was just how much of a slow burn this movie is. That it's longer than 30 minutes before you actually find out what the Matrix is. There is a lot of mystery that's hidden really well. The marketing for this film, I think, was genius. You did not, that was the tagline, what is the Matrix? And it looked like in the trailers, at least my impression was, that there was some kind of supernatural aspect to it instead of the technical thing, which is an interesting concept too, where they kind of blend this mythology and, technology. And it's kind of like what am I trying to say? That it takes, it disproves supernatural, like it's all kind of explained away through technology, and yet that also there's this tension between the supernatural still happening at the same time in mythology and religious archetypes and that kind of stuff. So fascinating film. Strikes lots of interesting balances between those things. My last thing I'll mention before we jump into some of the aspects is that I really appreciate how much that reveal of the real world is so disorienting for the viewer as much as it is for Neo. And I remember that, just seeing it for the first time, what is happening? I have no idea. And it just pulls you in. And when that reveal happens, like, we're exactly in the same place that Neo's at.
Yeah, you get to, as an audience member, you get to feel what Neo is feeling. I do actually want to, you brought up the fact that it's kind of a slow burn. And I know what you mean, because you really don't find out a lot about the Matrix. Like, it's kind of spoon fed to you, like in little doses throughout the first half the movie. Really, right? I think even until, you could even say that you're still learning things right up till close to the third act. which I also think is kind of how Neo experiences it. And, one of the strengths of hero's journey narratives is that you generally have like this, I don't want to say like farm boy, but he's like someone who's an outsider, just like the audience is. And so you get introduced to everything as the characters being introduced to it, which helps for exposition, the pacing of the film. I actually thought that it wasn't a slow burn. I actually felt that it gripped me quite quickly. And, so I know what you mean about the information kind of as a
Right.
slow drip. But what struck me at the very beginning of the film was how quickly it grabbed my attention, just stylistically. The editing choice to have like a couple, the green screen. Like I think the very opening shot of the film is the green screen, couple numbers, which we find out is part of the Matrix. But, you have the voiceover. And Trinity is talking to someone. I don't quite remember who Trinity was talking to.
It's Cypher, yeah.
Yeah. And she says something like, is this line safe, or are people listening? And they hang up, and then you have the police come in. And I just thought it was like, you mentioned the word mysterious, and I think that's definitely the case. But it's such an interesting, like, you want to know more about what's going on. And so, I think from that editing scene to scene perspective, they did a really good job of doling out that information just enough where you kind of understood, okay, what's going on? Where are we going? And then asking just enough questions, not to leave you confused, but to leave you wanting more.
I really like that phrase used, slow drip.
Mm-hmm.
And I will adopt that, because you're right. Slow burn tends to be used in terms of a film taking a while to get your attention, and you have to be patient for it. This film does not ask you to be patient, other than what the answers are coming.
Right.
What answers are coming. It does grab your attention immediately. We get, to kind of skip down to cinematography for just a bit. We get to see a little bit of bullet time almost immediately, right? We see, Trinity leap into the air, and then it freezes and it pans around. And it's like, now that scene's been parodied so many times. I think of Shrek immediately.
Yeah, that's exactly what I thought too.
But at the time in '99, this was mind blowing. We'd never seen anything like this.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're like, how is this possible? We have no idea, but we want to know.
What I also love, though, is that, that scene is, like I said, at the very beginning of the film, it tells you exactly what kind of movie it's going to be right off the bat.
Another one of my favorite shots in the film, and I'm sure you like this one as well, is where you have Neo's choices, whether to take the red or the blue pill, in Morpheus's glasses, where they have him exactly in each half of his face. It's just a beautiful shot. There, I also had the computer screens with the green vertical text being a very gripping, interesting, pulls you into the film. You don't know quite what's going on, and it's one of the signature images in the film for sure. And you also see it in one of the greatest moments in the film, where Neo sees the Matrix for really what it is. Like after he dies and comes back, the apotheosis of the hero's journey, and you see the agents in kind of silhouette in that too.
I also think that that scene with the two pills, the red pill, the blue pill, there's some just pleasant composition where it's not just a shot reverse shot conversation. There is parts of that, but you also see moments of acting, like physical acting between the two, where you have like Morpheus on one side, Neo on the other. And at various times throughout the conversation, you'll see Neo lean forward, and then you'll see Morpheus lean forward and Neo lean back. And then you'll have the composition where both characters are sitting on either side, and you have the glass of water sitting right there in the exact middle of the frame, because that's kind of the key, right? Once you make your choice, blue pill or red pill, that's the beginning of the hero's journey right there.
Right. You pick your side.
Exactly.
Quite literally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's just some very pleasant composition. And speaking of that, just as far as the cinematography, this is a very kinetic movie in terms of camera movement and cinematography. There's not a lot of stillness in the film.
No.
You get a little bit, I think, when the characters are on the Nebuchadnezzar,
Hmm.
the ship. But other than that, like there's just a lot of motion. There's also a lot of depth to the film where the Wachowskis will have a foreground and background, and they will do the focus rack on that to draw your
Hmm.
attention. Um, One last thing I noticed for cinematography is if you take a look at the composition, if the composition is kind of a rectangle on your TV screen, they would very often have up to like a whole half of the screen framed out, whether that's the back of someone's head or a chair, whatever it is. And they would cut the focus of the composition to essentially a square, one half of the square on that rectangle that is your TV screen. So there was a lot of cinematography moves that the Wachowskis and cinematographer, put into this film. And I found that actually really refreshing. I kind of wish I would see a little bit more of that in some of the action films that are coming out in more recent ones.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I really like what you said about the dynamic camera movement and how everything's moving all the time, except for certain moments, and they
Mm-hmm.
use it so sparingly. Like I think about the time where you're looking at the woman in the red dress and it pauses. It's really jarring because it's one of the few times that the camera's not moving, and it's just that much more powerful. I looked up the cinematographer for this film is Bill Pope, who did the entire Matrix trilogy, and has done a ton of stuff. But like he's very versatile. I mean, he did Spider-Man's 2 and 3, which we've already done, a bunch of stuff for Sam Raimi, Army of Darkness. But he also did he did Shang-Chi, he did Ant-Man and the Wasp, the new Quantumania. So that'll be interesting to see if there's some things in that film. But I don't think he has a style that I'll be like, yep, that's a Bill Pope movie.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's amazing that this movie doesn't feel like those other movies.
Yeah. Well, and this also this feels like a kung fu movie in a lot of ways,
Oh, sure.
right? There's a lot of martial arts. And I think that style of cinematography, that very kinetic style that they use, works so well with it. And there's one more thing that popped into my head. The fighting scenes, they are not cut up like a lot of modern movies are. Like the actual just moment to moment editing, it lingers just a little bit longer. And there's still cuts and stuff, but it does tend to linger and just let you watch the movement of the actors and the camera moving with it. And I absolutely love that. I think that a lot of movies fall into this habit of cutting for quick dramatic, to make things exciting. But it veers off into incoherent editing in some action scenes where you don't really know who's hitting who, what's happening, where they are, and there's a lot of clarity as far as the editing and cinematography in this film, which is just great.
Yeah, I agree. I think of like the dojo scene
Mm-hmm.
is really, it lingers. Like you get to see and it's full frame too. Like you can see head to toe.
Yeah.
You can tell that it's the actors that are actually doing the martial arts. Along with that too, I noticed this time there's a lot of bird's eye view looking down on the action sequences as well. So like there's not a lot of ways you can hide what's happening by going straight down, but it's also disorienting because it's in the Matrix, which is again intentional, right? That it should be disorienting that they're in the Matrix, and this is the way that you're viewing things. It's a little bit off. The thing I love color wise, I did want to mention this too, is how you have that kind of neon green filter when they're in the Matrix, which looking back at it now, you're like, well, obviously in the Matrix, because look at the screen. But at the time when you didn't know what it was, it didn't really register
Mm-hmm.
on any kind of intellectual level, maybe emotionally. But I've seen television shows. I think Supernatural did a whole season where they kind of use that green filter for no reason at all other than, hey, this kind of looks cool. And so there's enough of that where you're like, yeah, I can kind of go with it. I'm not really thinking, hey, there's something weird. But it's so different in the real world. And, they use longer lenses and they soften the backgrounds and stuff in the real world. So it's a very different, it's like two very different movies.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, what a challenge to take that on, too.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect example of using. I mean, like you said, looking back on it, it's pretty obvious. Like it's not exactly subtle, but that's fine. And I think it clearly is indicating that there are two different worlds in this film, and the characters have to go back and forth between them. And it is just a nice, if obvious, simple visual cue for the audience to know where characters are.
Another thing I wanted to mention too was just how great this movie does at asking the question about what is real.
Mm-hmm.
Because in many ways, what's in the Matrix is real. I mean, when they talk at some point about, if you die in the Matrix, then you die in real life. So it's real in like electrical impulses into your brain. It's real in every way except for, I don't know. I mean, really, like it's pretty stinking real. It's just not what we would consider. It's not the norm.
Mm-hmm.
It's artificial, but does that mean that it's not real? And they ask tons of questions like that in this film, which is pretty great.
Now, do you think, I'm trying to remember, and I think this is correct, internet was dial-up when this came out in 1999. Is that right?
You're dating me a little bit here. Yeah.
I mean, it was
Yeah.
around that time. At least I think we
Yeah, it
could
was
say
right
that
around
pretty
that time.
safely, right?
Yeah. Yeah, having to wait. Okay, so I'm thinking of like 99 is the same year as The Phantom Menace and having to wait 2 hours to download the trailer for Phantom Menace. So that tracks. Yeah. Because we'd wait 2 hours. I did that for Tomb Raider too. Gotta see this.
So, I thought it feels anachronistic. I know that's not quite the right word, but it feels where, the Matrix is this super high-tech advanced AI, and then they still have dial-up where they can only escape through like telephones because
Right.
the dial-up. It strikes me as more kind of cute in a campy kind of way. Like, yeah, the movie kind of dates itself.
Yeah.
In that
But
sense.
A genius stroke to say, you know what, this is only 1999, kind of like we went back to the peak of your civilization. So, that's what it is here. And we don't know what year it is now.
Yeah.
Right. So we can't be like, it's Back to the Future. It's 2015. Like, where's my flying cars? Like, it could be 500 years from now. We don't know. I did have, speaking of dial-up internet, that was one of the sounds that I picked up. That was like, wow, I remember that. And that is a distinctive, and now it's like very much associated with the Matrix films. That and the wow transforming sounds. There's so many of those as well. And yeah, contrasted with the future tech. You have that dial-up internet and then
like robots flying around.
Sure. I'm not sure what's going on there. The score. What do you think about the score?
So overall, I thought like the score did a pretty good job where it felt, I think it fit, like it was appropriate for the film. What stood out to me were the chase scenes. There's a number of them, and the music. It's got this real bouncing, kind of bubbly, like score. It's not this kind of like frenetic, scary theme, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's moments later in the movie where it has a very superhero vibe to it, which works on a couple different levels for this film. But I think it's kind of an interesting choice because to me it read superhero as Neo is kind of coming into his role in the end when he's fighting Agent Smith. Yeah, I liked it. There wasn't anything other than that really stood out to me.
Yeah, it fits definitely. I thought this time picking up there's kind of a metallic clanging sound through a lot of the like those chase scenes that you're mentioning and some of the action sequences mixed with kind of a more traditional symphonic score. But what's great, I really liked it going back to that dojo scene again too, where it kind of starts that way and then it changes into like this very distinctive Asian flavor with drums and stuff like that. And then that morphs into like an EDM, like electronic dance music. There's a lot of that too. Like the lobby scene has that too. So there's
yeah.
again very versatile. I mean, I'm assuming that the cinematographer and the composer Don Davis are both like, hey, we want you guys because you guys can do lots of different stuff because we're going to be mixing this up because it is it's a blend of so many things. You mentioned kung fu and it's anime, it's superhero. It's kind of
Hero's
hard to nail
Journey.
hero's journey. It's kind of hard to nail down exactly what kind of traditional sci-fi, what kind of movie The Matrix actually is. It's
Yeah,
a lot of these things.
it is. And that's actually a great point where in a lot of ways it is a very mythic tale in that it kind of just hero with a thousand faces style. It's like it doesn't matter the culture or the time period. It kind of synthesizes and blends a bunch of different things together.
Yeah. The last thing I wanted to talk about with sound, and it's always stuck out to me as brilliant, is we have this Harp Stinger in the scene where Cypher is talking to Agent Smith,
Yeah, the dinner
and he
scene.
says,
Yeah.
"Yep," and he says, "Ignorance is bliss," and then you hear, the and it's like, okay.
Yeah.
I think and it's really subtle. It's brief, but it always kind of just went, oh, okay, this is something important that I'm paying attention to. So
Yeah.
it's the only time harp's used in the film, so it must be important. It's this kind of artificial, everything's going to be okay. Ignorance is not bliss. But that seems to be how Cypher is convincing himself that it's okay to do what he's doing.
Right. I don't even know if he really believes that it's okay. I think he's just willing to do it.
Mm-hmm. So moving down to performance, was there anything that stuck out to you that you want to start with?
So I think for the performance, I think this is an interesting film, in the sense that I'll say this. One of the things that stood out to me performance wise is the agent's voice and cadence it felt manufactured. It feels different, artificial, which I think is a really cool choice to use because obviously they're computers, they're robots, they're not human. So it makes perfect sense that their speech patterns would be it's like uncanny valley, where it's like very obvious that you understand what they're saying, but it's also just like there's just something off about how they're saying it. So I thought that was the best part. And I think all of the agents they're all their own unique, cadence, but they were all kind of slightly different. Otherwise, I thought the acting was all pretty good across the board. I think Keanu Reeves, he's not my favorite actor. I don't, he's fine. But I think he's one of those actors who feels a little bit more one note to me. I don't know if he has the range that a lot of other actors have. And it works in this film particularly because I think that's kind of who Mr. Anderson is. He's one note. He's got this kind of whole secret life, but really he's kind of, he's going to kind of do his thing and try to stay under the surface. And as he comes into becoming Neo, I felt like Keanu Reeves pulled off that transition as well as I could have hoped.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I thought he's very minimalist. He doesn't emote a whole lot, and I think it fits for this. For somebody he's been in, like romantic movies, and it's like that's just not right.
He was cast really well for this film.
That's what I think. Yeah, and it's interesting to see if you go down the list, he's not the first choice of anybody. Will Smith was the first choice for this movie and turned it down for Wild Wild West. Oh my goodness. Yeah, we should do that movie at some point just because it is so bad. But how much different a movie would that have been with Will Smith, right? So Keanu's great in this. I think that Lawrence Fishburne is amazing. And I think that one of the reasons he's amazing in this film is that he has to do a lot of exposition. He has to tell us everything because we don't know anything. And I'm enraptured while he's talking. I'm fully sucked in. He's, the cadence of his voice, the deep timbre, it's great. But you also have other characters that do some exposition, and it doesn't work. for me. Like Carrie Ann Moss telling things about the squids and the EMP, and there's like one point where I think it's Dozer that completes her sentence, search and destroy. It's like it sounds so cheesy, right? It doesn't work. That takes me out of the film. It always
Yeah.
has.
Yeah.
But like Lawrence Fishburne could read the phone book and I'd be like, yes. And then we're on to the M's. Tell me more.
Yeah.
And Hugo Weaving also is fantastic. Doing amazing things with a very, again, like kind of restrictive part. It's like you can't really be showing emotions, but he kind of goes right up to the edge and like comes back down. And like I think this is the first movie I'd ever seen him in, because he hadn't done Lord of the Rings yet. And it was like, who is this guy? This guy's great. He's super charismatic, even as this very wooden character.
Yeah, I 100% agree about Lawrence Fishburne. I think he, in a lot of ways, for me, I think he's kind of the star as far as the quality of acting. I think he's on top. I think Keanu is cast really well and fits his role, but Lawrence Fishburne is kind of stealing the show. Exactly what you were saying, where it's like when he's talking, I'm listening and I'm buying it. I love the exposition that he has. Like it's entertaining. He feels like Morpheus. Like I believe it. And like you were saying, some of the other actors who are giving that exposition, it feels more like they're reciting the lines rather than like Morpheus and Lawrence Fishburne are kind of one and the same, and they believe in Neo, right? And it's like, yeah, you can tell it. I believe him. I'm buying what he's selling. Some of the others, not so much. And not that it's bad all the time. I think Carrie Ann Moss is totally fine most of the time. But some of those exposition dumps, for lack of a better term, are a little rougher.
Yeah. I also have a hard time with the quote unquote chemistry between Keanu Reeves and Carrie Ann Moss. I mean, it's the male lead and the female lead.
Yeah.
So they're destined to fall in love. She's destined to fall in love with the dead man. That seems to be her motivation for falling in love with him, because she was told to. Although I do wonder if her kiss is the thing that brings Neo back from the dead. Kind of,
A little fairy tale vibe.
little fairy tale vibe there, a little bit. This time on the watch through, I was like, well, it did happen immediately after. I don't know if, happening after is actually causation, but the timing was interesting. So many good lines in this movie, though. Like, I always try to pull out like 2 or 3 instances of dialogue that I really like, and there's just too many. I filled up like a page and a half of dialogue. And so I won't share all of them. I'm just going to share one, but this would be a good opportunity for those of us, our listeners. And we've got some new listeners too. I just want to throw that, like, there's somebody in France listening to us. How's it going over there in France? Thank you for listening to us. Anybody though, if you guys have quotes from The Matrix that you like, please share them with us. Twitter, Facebook, email, SpeakPipe, what have you. My favorite line though is this little exchange from Morpheus and Neo, and it's in the scene with the woman with the red dress. It's at the tail end, and Neo says, "What are you trying to tell me? That I can dodge bullets?" Which is a cool question, but the response, "No, Neo, I'm trying to tell you that when you're ready, you won't have to." And I'm getting chills right now just thinking about it. Like, what kind of power is that? And then we get the payoff even more, and like, yes, I remember that. He freezes the bullets in midair, and it's just like, that is amazing.
Yeah. Well,
it's freaking awesome.
And I think it's great because you get that payoff at the end of the film too.
Yeah. What about you? Did you have any?
So that was one that was one that I really liked. For me, it was the red pill, blue pill. So Morpheus says, "This is your last chance. After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed, you believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes." And in particular, it's that last part right there. And what I love about it is that's the invitation to adventure. And that to me is like, such a cool moment in the story where it's like, okay, I want you to take the red pill. Like, let's see how deep the rabbit hole goes,
Yeah.
and that's it. It's like a moment of like, it reminded me of when I'm reading a good book and I get to the end of a cliffhanger at the end of a chapter, and I'm like, I want to see what happens next, right? That's what it felt like. And then you have a great like crawling through the wall action scene after that. So
Yeah. Good stuff. So I kind of ripped on Keanu Reeves' acting. I did a little earlier. But I do want to say, when it comes to body language, I picked up something this time that I don't think I'd ever picked up before. Because it ends with him vomiting when he comes out after getting here's the thing about you're a battery and all of that stuff, and shows the baby eating other liquefied babies and whatever else. Horrible. Yeah, we would all vomit. But if you watch the whole scene, like, you can see him growing uncomfortable and kind of nauseous throughout the whole, like, it's a couple of minutes. It's a good 2 or 3 minutes where he is progressively getting, you can kind of see him kind of swallowing a little bit. So I think it's a really solid piece of acting where he's very measured, but it's progressively getting worse until you actually have that, yep, now I'm done, and here it comes.
another moment was when he was in the police station, and I think he was talking to Agent Smith, and Keanu Reeves flips Agent Smith off, and he gives me like, give me my phone call. And Smith says something like, what good is a phone call if you can't speak? And the physical acting that Keanu Reeves does for that, I think, is really good too.
Yeah, I had that one as well. Yeah, I'm like, wow, actually this guy, if I give him credit, if I'm looking for it, he can actually pull this off. The scene, another great thing about that scene, and I probably should have mentioned this in cinematography, is how that scene begins is fascinating, because it starts and it's so quick. The first time you watch The Matrix and you haven't seen the other ones, you see like all the little monitors, like, oh, it's so quick. You're like, I don't even know what that is. I'm moving on. And now we know, of course, that's the architect is watching them. So it's interesting that they had that, 4 years before the sequel, that they just kind of seeded that one little glimpse of that to kind of really tell us, like, we don't even know he's in the Matrix yet. Like,
Yeah.
what is happening here?
Yeah.
So kind of a cool little, but like it feels heavy-handed, like on the outside, like, after knowing it, but I didn't catch that first time I saw the film. So kudos to the Wachowskis. Nice job. What do you think about the costumes?
So, yeah, I was kind of thinking about that. And I wanted to touch on something that's sort of related, like production design in general. And this is also kind of related to cinematography a little bit. But just what struck me is that there's like a lot of moments throughout the film that are lit very harshly. There's very deep shadows. It's very, very dark. And then you also got really, really harsh lighting. And so just like the overall production design in some of like the hallways and when they're inside the Matrix, especially early on in the film, it is really like black and white. Like there's lots of shadows, lots of darkness. There were moments when like Morpheus and some of the other characters, they're all wearing, like black. They blend in so much with the background in certain scenes. And then there's such a contrast also in just the lighting when they're in the real world, when they're on the ship. Everything's much softer. Everything's lit a little bit more evenly, as if it were normal lighting. It's not as dramatic in that sense of like production design. They really, not just the color, but they really tried to differentiate between these two different worlds.
Yeah, the angles are very sharp as well. Like all the architecture and everything in the Matrix is very boxy, and you don't get really rounded shapes in the real world. I do find it interesting that the good guys are wearing black.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of an interesting subversion. I've always wondered how come Morpheus's glasses don't have like ear stems or whatever they're called.
He's just that cool.
He's just that. He's like, I don't need any of that stuff. I'm going to put it on my nose, and I'm that cool. It stays on.
And his green tie, his Matrix tie.
Very nice. And then, so again, another contrast. You have rags, threadbare clothes in the real world versus these very stylized very fancy, very expensive, custom clothes in the Matrix.
Mm-hmm.
The whole concept, of residual self-image. I've always liked that. Just thought
Yeah.
that was amazing. Another great kind of philosophical, question. How we view. No, what's more important, how we view ourselves, or how the rest of the world does. This it doesn't answer that, but it asks it, which I think is more important. As far as locations, just about everything is, in a computer,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, it was filmed in Sydney, so there's some like a lot of the cityscapes are Sydney without all the. You don't get to see the Opera House, of course, because it's supposed to be just a generic American city. But the locations feel real, even though they're on a soundstage. Like the Nebuchadnezzar feels real. You have that used universe concept, which of course, Star Wars is kind of the grandfather of all of that. Yeah, the late '90s tech is kind of fun. The cell phones. I remember thinking those were so cool, and now it's like, wow, that's dated. And then the patchwork tech in the real world. So everything's broken down and used versus brand new. And again, you have this great contrast between like you never have a doubt, which part of are you in the Matrix or the real world?
Mm-hmm.
It's very clear. So an excellent job done with that. The analog phone booths. I love seeing phone booths in movies just because I'm like, I remember those. That's what that is, kids. We used to have to put a quarter in there. It was a dime at one point. And how about that little tracker bug thing that goes in his belly button?
Yeah.
That's an interesting prop.
Yeah. That's really well filmed too. I mean,
Yeah.
and that brings up a point where some of the CGI has aged really well and some of it has not.
Yeah, so that's a good example of CGI.
Yeah.
What's a bad example, just off the top of your head?
Actually, that one when Agent Smith first picks it up,
Yeah.
He's got it looks like a cigarette case or something, and he picks it up and it like transforms, and that looked really dated.
Yeah.
Now the actual when they were like pulling it out of Neo,
yeah,
that was really solid.
Yeah,
those effects really held up well. I think some of the flying around, the kung fu, the martial arts fighting, I thought that all worked really well.
Yeah. A lot of stuff done in frame. There's a lot of wire work and things like that. Real stunts.
Mm-hmm.
So you see that like in the second movie, like you'd like the brawl with all the Smiths, like that doesn't hold up nearly.
No, it does not.
It's let's see, that's 2003. So
yeah,
it's pretty early on.
Stretching what you could believably do, I think.
Yeah. This film hasn't quite done that yet. So.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So characters, we talked a little bit about the casting is always just fascinating to me because this was definitely a film where it wasn't like, hey, these are the people we wanted from the beginning. Mentioned Will Smith was a possibility at one point. It turned it down. Nicolas Cage turned it down. A lot of people turned it down because this was like the Wachowskis had not made a big movie.
Yeah.
This came out of nowhere. I mean, we talk about now how, it doesn't have to be released in the summer to be a big movie. This came out early. Like this was like a March release, I believe. Let me double check that. Yeah, March 31st. So this is not a summer movie. This came out. I remember it came out earlier than Phantom Menace, and so that was like, oh my gosh, the Phantom Menace can be so amazing because this was good. That was kind of the way we looked at it. So it's kind of buried a little bit. It kind of came out of nowhere. So you have all these people turn it down. Brad Pitt turned it down. Val Kilmer turned it down. Leonardo DiCaprio turned it down. Johnny Depp turned it down. And finally, they settle on Ted, Keanu Reeves, and he's fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Morpheus, as Lawrence Fishburne as Morpheus. At one point, Gary Oldman was considered. Samuel L. Jackson, who I love Samuel L. Jackson, but I don't like that for him.
I don't think it fits Sam Jackson.
No.
I think Gary Oldman's also a fantastic actor. It's so hard because that role is so like molded to Lawrence Fishburne. Like I don't think you can like tear it apart. It feels wrong to think of other actors in that role.
Yeah. Yeah. The last one I will bring up is for Trinity. We have Carrie-Anne Moss, who like to absolutely put her on the map.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for the most part she's really, really good in the film. I think that she does what she's given. and she's reasonably charismatic. Like I said, the chemistry thing is kind of iffy, but she's captivating on screen. You can't take your eyes off her. Like starting with the beginning of the film, so she's really good in the role. Janet Jackson, of all people, was offered the role to begin, right? Salma Hayek auditioned for it, and so did Jada Pinkett Smith, who later, of course, shows up as Niobe in the second movie. But I think the cast, for the most part, is pretty solid. I don't think there's anybody that like, oh my gosh, this guy's in the movie. Why is he here?
Right.
And there's lots of smaller parts that they don't have to do a whole lot. I really like Joe Pantoliano. I think he's fantastic as Cypher. He's got I think, other than Agent Smith, other than Hugo Weaving, he has the most personality. Because even though Lawrence Fishburne's great, he's not, and charismatic, he's just kind of, I don't want to say he's one note, but he sticks right in the pocket, where Cypher is, you want to like him. And then that's brilliant, right? Because he is kind of charismatic. And so you're like, oh, he's the bad guy. He's a traitor. That stinks. So I liked that guy. So it's a good casting choice there. Moving down, we're at Hero's Journey. We're officially at Hero's Journey. We made it. And one thing I did want to say about this was, as great as this movie fits Hero's Journey, I used it. This was the first time that I started teaching Hero's Journey in school. This was one of the 4 movies that I used to show the patterns. And then after a year or two, not enough kids had seen it, so I had no idea what it was. And so my big question for you, Matt, is The Matrix still relevant?
That's a really interesting question. Short answer is yes. Longer answer is I think it's still relevant, but it may be relevant for different things. We talked about how very early on, The Matrix is kind of famous for some of the use of its special effects, right? And it kind of opened up Hollywood and audiences to the idea that you could make these kinds of effects believable and they would work. That is not what's going to capture new audiences. Because, like we said, some doesn't hold up. A lot of it still does, but it's not as jaw-dropping as it was when it was first released. I do, however, think that it's still a really solid film. And I think stylistically, it's different enough that it's really interesting to talk about it, especially contrasting it to other films. I mean, I just think about, like, right off the top of my head, it'd be so interesting to do an analysis of like how much the camera moves in The Matrix versus something like Phantom Menace. 2 movies that were coming out very close to each other. The opposites of an unknown in George Lucas and the Wachowskis, where, like you said, virtual unknowns until The Matrix came out. I think that it is a movie that you could definitely study and look at to learn more about filmmaking. And so I think on that level, I think it'll always be relevant. I think all good movies are relevant in their own way, at least for that reason, other than just being an entertaining film. I think there's a lot of very interesting, when we talk about cinematic language, there's a lot of meat that you can kind of gnaw on for this movie.
Love it. Yeah, I agree with all of that. I would just like to add that I think narratively that it asks some very interesting questions, specifically whether or not Neo is the one by destiny or by choice. He goes to the Oracle and there's all these potentials, which I think is an interesting curveball to throw in there. Morpheus believes that he is, and then Neo is ultimately told that he's not. But is that just the push that he needs? And there's this, they never really answer that question. But I love that fact that it's like, well, maybe he is. Maybe he's, because he chooses to believe that he is the one, that he becomes the one. And so,
yeah, maybe it doesn't matter what destiny says.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have this really interesting balance between predestination and free will, which is, I mean, is there a more human question than that? Right? Are we in control of our lives, or is there something larger that's kind of putting us on our path? underworld. I had this kind of underworld building that kind of blends together. I mentioned earlier how it's this really interesting blend of like mythology, philosophy, and then tech, which explains away most of it, especially in the second movie. Well, this one they talk about deja vu is just a glitch in the Matrix. In the next movie, it's ghosts and vampires and all these things. They're not, they're not real. They don't actually happen. It's just, it's a computer glitch. But then you also have things, just to kind of a little bit into the next movie where Neo controls the Sentinels outside of the Matrix, which appears to be a very supernatural thing, unless he's got Wi-Fi. I'm not sure what's going on there. One of the theories that came out around this when that movie came out, and I just want to touch on this briefly because one of the reasons we're doing this film now is The Matrix Resurrections is going to be out a week after this episode comes out. Is the theory that I hope they revisit it, in that there's layers to the Matrix and that they never got out. That the real world is just one more level.
One more layer of the Matrix.
So I don't know if it's going to go there.
It'd be interesting.
I would love it if it would, because isn't that what like long-term sequels and prequels are supposed to do? Is like subvert all your expectations and completely reframe everything and like make everyone mad?
Not according to some Star Wars fans.
But like that would be, that's your Phantom Menace Last Jedi moment.
Yeah.
If they were to do that. And like, nope, you thought you had it figured out. It's not. So
it'll be interesting.
It'll be interesting.
Yeah.
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 Can't wait to see what it is. But if it's that, I'm going to freak out. Love too that this film, it builds on a lot of other mythologies. Like you have a lot of biblical references. The Nebuchadnezzar, we mentioned that. Zion. There's lots of like Judeo-Christian themes and names that show up in this. And of course, it builds on Japanese animation, martial arts films, and like stories with evil artificial intelligence like 2001, The Terminator, even Tron. But it's influenced almost as many things as I think it's pulled from. I love Inception, but there's no Inception if there's not The Matrix, right? Ready Player One, even like the new Jumanji movies, Free Guy, like The Matrix, they owe The Matrix for their existence.
Mm-hmm. So any final thoughts, Craig?
All right, here's my big final thought for you, Matt.
Okay.
Would you ever consider being plugged back into the Matrix like Cypher did?
Without thinking about it too much, no. Would you?
I don't think so, no.
Yeah.
Especially knowing that I'm going to be like a cannibal. That's the worst. That's the thing for me.
I think there's this sense of all the people outside of the Matrix remind me a lot of the rebellion, fighting against the evil empire. And I feel like there's this kind of brotherhood that exists where it's like, yeah, it would suck, but at the same time, there's also good to it, right? Like you're fighting the good fight, that kind of thing. So no, I don't think I'd be plugged back in. That's a great final thought. I wanted to briefly say that I think one thing that I love about the film is that it sets out this really specific and unique world for the story to inhabit. Where I feel like, we talked about how it's this blend of all these different things, but it also just feels, I don't know, it just feels refreshing. It felt like a really vivid world that you mentioned the lived in, world for the production design and stuff. It felt so complex and real. And I think that's just fun. I just enjoy that.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up because it may be interpreted from what I just said that it's kind of just a pastiche of a lot of different things and it's not really its own thing. And it is its own thing. Like in much the way that Star Wars is a blend of samurai and westerns and Joseph Campbell and myth and all of these things. It's still, there's this alchemy that has to happen for the film to become its own thing. And I do think that The Matrix achieved that. It is not, this is just like that. And you never had that feeling. And I think you still don't have, this is a ripoff of whatever else. It's, it fits the hero's journey, as does so many
Countless.
things.
Yeah.
Right, countless things. But it has its own mythology and its world building is solid enough that, it stands on its own.
Yeah. So as we close, we just want to say thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to connect with us, you can find us on Twitter and Facebook, email us at readingbetweenreels@gmail.com, or use the SpeakPipe app on our website.
If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a review on your favorite podcast catcher. We'd love to hear your feedback, and it really helps get the word out about the podcast. And if you haven't yet, please join our Facebook group. It's a safe place to share your thoughts and discuss all things related to movies.
And one last thing, our next few episodes are going to be reviews of some of our favorite episodes of The Mandalorian from Disney+. We'll be breaking down Redemption and The Tragedy, those two episodes. Send us an email or voicemail about your favorite moments from The Mandalorian, and we'll share them on the next episode.